Today's lesson is on the Articles of Confederation. Okay, scholars, the Articles of Confederation. Well, just to reiterate, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, and right after that, our new nation was looking for its own form of government. And I often reflect on the fact that what the Founding Fathers were trying to do was they were trying to create a government and a system, written form of government, based upon what they knew they did not want. After all, they had been through tyranny under Great Britain, and they knew that that is exactly the system that they did not want. So, they created a system, but they weren't quite sure how to go about doing that. So, what kind of system was created? They started with a confederal model. So what exactly is a confederation? Well, scholars, a confederation is a loosely tied association of states. So there was some unity at some level, but the unity was really flimsy and didn't really hold together. So you might say the glue wasn't the kind of glue that was necessary to keep the wood of the frame of our nation together. So the goal was to create a system of government which would safeguard against tyranny. They were going to set up a government with power and control, and they vested this power of government and control in the hands of the states. And they believed that this would be achieved through consensus and uniformity, stressing equality and equitable distribution of power among the states. The problem is, it really ended up handicapping the states because so many of the decisions that the new nation would endure would be based upon the unanimous consent of the governed. When we say unanimous, of course, scholars, we're talking about all the states had to concur. So in terms of being equitable and fair, you couldn't beat it. But the problem was, and certainly democratic and fair to everybody, like I said, you couldn't beat it. But the problem is you couldn't really enact policy in that way. So their sense was to create the fairest, most equitable system possible, and this, in turn, they argued, would create an additional safeguard against a possible tyrant or a tyranny kind of a result in the future for the new nation. It was argued that the system ended up being closer to the needs of the people because the states were themselves closer to the people than some kind of federal bureaucratic state. Alright, so what kind of powers did this new Articles of Confederation give? Well, it did allow for the conduct of war, making treaties and ability to exchange ambassadors. It did coin money and regulate value. It did establish and regulate a post office. It did allow for the appointment of military officers. It did allow for the regulation of Indian affairs and settlements of disputes among the states. So there were certain contributions to the Articles of Confederation. War and diplomacy, establishment of a federal system, and Western lands. But there were lots of problems with the Articles of Confederation. I now want to turn the lesson to looking at some of these problems. Number one, it didn't take long to realize that we couldn't really rule without a central power. We had a problem with war-making duties and obligations. Problem with coining and regulating money. Problem with governance. Like I said, scholars, earlier, there was this understanding of unanimous consent. And unanimous means everyone. And it was really hard to get all 13 delegates attending the Continental Congress to agree on certain issues, specifically war-making power and ratifying amendments. There was a problem with the unicameral legislative body. Congress was unable to collect taxes. Congress found itself essentially powerless to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. There was no separate executive branch to enforce acts of Congress. There was no national court system to interpret law. Like I said, amendments were only ratified with the consent of all the states. The Articles really created a firm league of friendship. And finally, the Confederation could not regulate trade. Additionally, there were weaknesses in foreign affairs. There was issues with the foreign occupation of the West. There was problems with the foreign debt. Remember, the United States had borrowed several $1 million from the French and the Dutch during the 1778 and 1783 time period. and it was harder to decide things under the Articles of Confederation. We had the Barbary Pirates. The U.S. did not have its own navy and could not properly defend itself from foreign invasions from the seas. And finally, I want to look at the weaknesses in domestic affairs. There was problems with commerce and trade, lacked power to regulate and control domestic and foreign trade. There was need of revenue. Congress had the inability to raise money since it had no power to do so. Political structure. It was hard for the U.S. to guarantee to every state a Republican form of government since the federal government had no power over the states. And we have Daniel Shays' rebellion, which I now want to talk about briefly with you this afternoon. Well, this rebellion came out as a direct result of many merchants and wealthy people who had loaned their money to the states during the American Revolutionary War. In short, the people who loaned money wanted it returned and paid back in the form of a specie. Now, a specie was gold or silver coins rather than paper money. The idea here was species were more scarce and worth much more. Now, Daniel Shays himself was a war veteran who was facing jail because of all of his debts. And in 1786, he led a rebellion that quietly and quickly spread throughout most of Massachusetts. The citizens of Massachusetts protested the new taxes via petitions and public meetings. When the state courts refused to hear their petitions, the rebels forced the courts to close, and Shays, in addition to a small army, marched on the city of Springfield, Massachusetts, where guns were stored at an arsenal base. The conflict escalated, and Congress realized it lacked power. This was a direct result of not having enough money to raise an army and could not force the states to pay for an army. The significance of this case? Well, it proved to the United States unequivocally that it lacked a kind of national and central power that it desperately needed to deal effectively with problems not only of this nature, but in general. Since the U.S. was not capable of dealing with civil unrest, in May of 1787, the Annapolis Convention convened. 12 states sent delegates, and James Madison was spearheaded to draft a revised constitution, which would become eventually our nation's second constitution, which we all know today as simply the United States Constitution. Now, at this point, one last point, while the Constitutional Convention was occurring, there was two factions which occurred. One, the Federalists, under the spearhead of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who would later write a series of newspaper editorials known as the Federalist Papers, designed to convince the swing states, especially the state of New York, to ratify the U.S. Constitution. There was a lot of controversy and debate which ensued starting with the Annapolis Convention over this new form of government. So like I said, the Federalists would start writing their newspaper editorials that would appear in the local newspaper of the day under the pseudonym Publius. Now, while they were writing theirs, there was another group, the Anti-Federalists, which were writing theirs. And some of the famous Anti-Federalists include Samuel Bryan, who wrote under the pseudonym name of Sentinel, Richard Henry Lee, who wrote under the pseudonym of Federal Farmer, Melancton Smith, Robert Yates, who wrote under the pseudonym of Brutus, James Wilson, James Winthrop, and Patrick Henry. This would obviously lead to a tremendous division between the two, both the Anti-Federalists arguing for the stability of the existing Articles of Confederation and the Federalists arguing in favor of a new Constitution. This will be brought up more in a subsequent lecture on the Constitution. That concludes our lesson for the Articles of Confederation. Thank you for listening and watching.